In overall command of operations against Finland was General K.N. Meretskov. Hard-working and with a highly developed sense of what was politically possible, Meretskov was no fool. In a report to his Leningrad party boss, he warned of the inherent dangers of crossing Finland's perilous terrain. On the 29th of October, Defense Commissar K.E. Voroshilov ordered Meretskov to develop an operational plan for the encirclement and complete annihilation of the Finnish army by means of coordinated land, sea and air attacks. A month later, all was ready. Soviet air forces were to strike the main population centres of Finland, paralysing the main communication and transportation system, and destroying the small Finnish air force. Simultaneously, the Baltic Fleet would bombard and neutralise Finnish coastal fortifications, while naval landing forces seized key islands in the Gulf of Finland. While these operations were still underway, Soviet armoured columns were to strike deep into the heart of Finland on 4 major axes of advance on a 1,000-kilometre front, from Karelia in the south to Petsamo in the north. Within days, it would all be over. To face this onslaught, Finland had managed to mobilise about 180,000 men, organised into 8 infantry divisions and a number of independent battalions. The main strength was concentrated on the Karelian Isthmus, where 6 divisions of 2 corps took up defensive positions along the Mannerheim line. To the north of Lake Ladoga, manning a line of about 100 kilometres, were another 2 divisions, organised into another corps. The remaining 1,000 kilometres to the Arctic Sea was covered by the North Finland Group, a collection of civic guards, border guards and activated reservists. Finnish commanders were to experience 2 very different types of combat. A grinding, attritional defensive battle in the Karelian Isthmus, and a war of rapid manoeuvre and sudden ambush north of Lake Ladoga. Mannerheim's commanders at the operational level in Karelia were General Hugo Osterman, commander of the army of the Karelian Isthmus, and his corps commanders, General Harold Olqvist, who commanded 2nd Corps, and General Erich Heinrichs, who commanded 3rd Corps. They were intelligent officers, capable of highly flexible responses to difficult situations, but they lacked experience. The men disagreed with Mannerheim's argument for a layered defence of the Karelian Isthmus, and were much more enthusiastic about launching a counter-offensive when the initial Soviet thrust had been blunted. The Jaeger tradition of Finnish officers was put into practice in the forest fighting north of Lake Ladoga. Here, the heroes of a guerrilla war on skis emerged to capture the popular imagination, not just of Finland, but of virtually the entire world. Men like business executive Paavo Talvela, the prominent lawyer Jalmar Stalasvuo, and the rabble-rousing right-wing politician Kurt Wallenius led their forces with a flair and a dash completely foreign to the Soviet army of that time. At least one famed Finnish ski commander, Kurt Wallenius, discovered that he couldn't take the pressure. Appointed to command a hastily formed reserve on the Mannerheim line in late February, he immediately took to the bottle to steady his nerves, and stayed drunk for 3 days. On the 3rd of March, Mannerheim relieved him of command. The Finns knew that in any war with the USSR they would be on the defensive, but they vowed that it should be an active defence. They were light on firepower, but very good in terms of mobility and lower-level tactics. The forest itself dictated a heavy emphasis on individual initiative and small unit operations, quasi-guerrilla style. Marksmanship, mental agility, woodcraft, orienteering, camouflage and physical fitness were stressed, and parade ground compliments were discouraged. Unconventional tactics, ambushes, long-range patrols, deceptions, raids were enshrined as doctrine and refined. The Finns intended to absorb the first Soviet strikes, delay the enemy, let him wear himself down, and then counterattack. Just after dawn on the 30th of November 1939, Russian SB-2 medium bombers attacked strategic points in Helsinki, killing 200 on the first day of the war. Over the next 48 hours, reports poured into Mannerheim's HQ of Soviet attacks from the Gulf of Finland in the south to the Arctic coast. In Finland's far north, elements of the White Sea Fleet bombarded Finn positions on the Raibachi Peninsula. Shortly afterwards, troops of the Soviet 104th Division stormed ashore. Faced with overwhelming odds, the Finns pulled back south along the Arctic Highway, abandoning the port of Petsamo. There was no alternative. Mannerheim knew that any attempt to hold the port would result in a siege, and he had no way of keeping the garrison supplied. On the 1st of December, the Soviet cruiser Kirov and 2 large destroyers opened fire on Finnish fortifications at Hanko on the Gulf of Finland. Finnish coastal batteries remained silent until the Russian ships were within range, and then loosed a salvo. They scored a direct hit on one of the destroyers, which put about abruptly and limped out of range behind a smokescreen. Finnish batteries then straddled Kirov, with at least one shell smashing into the engine room. Losing power rapidly, Kirov withdrew from action as fast as she could, and was towed back to Kronstadt. On land, the Finns were doing less well. As Mannerheim thought, the main Soviet offensive thrust came up the Karelian Isthmus. It was here, on a front of some 80 kilometers, that Meretskov had concentrated 120,000 troops, supported by 1,000 tanks. Directly in front of the main defensive line, Mannerheim had created a buffer zone, some 20 to 45 kilometers deep, in which villages had been razed and booby-trapped, and mines had been planted. About 21,000 Finnish soldiers held strong points in this zone, their role to break up and disorganize Soviet formations before they reached the main defensive positions. In some places, this strategy worked. On the southwest coast, the Soviets ran into determined resistance before the village of Terijoki, where Finnish companies counterattacked during the night of the 30th of November, 1st of December, and succeeded in retaking lost positions. But elsewhere, Finnish forces abandoned positions, sometimes on the merest rumor that the Russians were approaching. On the 4th of December, a furious Mannerheim stormed into General Osterman's HQ, demanding that the forces in the buffer zone offer firmer resistance to the Soviet advance. Osterman, who regarded the buffer zone policy as too risky for Finland's semi-trained troops, offered his resignation, which Mannerheim refused to accept. Had the Soviets reached the Mannerheim line at this time, they may have triggered a major crisis in the Finnish ranks. But the Russians advanced sluggishly, their massive mechanized columns immobilized for hours at a time in huge traffic jams. It was not until the 6th of December that Soviet forward units reached the line, and not until the 8th of December that artillery and ammunition had been brought forward in significant quantities. By this time, Mannerheim was receiving alarming reports from all along Finland's 1,000-kilometre frontier with the USSR north of Lake Ladoga. A fairly developed road and rail system ran along the northern shore of the lake, and along this advanced 3 Soviet divisions, far more than Mannerheim had thought the Soviets could logistically sustain. Here, there was no defence line. The defending troops, Finland's 4th Corps, too weak to hold ground, had to rely on a mobile defence. Finnish sappers blew up a dam on Lake Sujärvi, about 16 kilometres northeast of Ladoga, which flooded the Soviets' main line of advance for a few hours before the water froze. On the 3rd of December, the Finns attempted a counterattack, but the sudden appearance of Russian tanks stopped them in their tracks. They disengaged hurriedly and withdrew to the western bank of the Aitujaki River. The next day, the Soviets crossed in strength, pushing the Finns back to the road junction at Tolvajärvi, from where it was possible that the Soviets might come around the north of Lake Ladoga and take the Mannerheim line from the rear. Further north still, the Soviet 163rd and 44th Divisions ground along tracks and logging roads towards the main north-south highway junction at Suomussalmi, a town with a peacetime population of about 4,000. So certain was Mannerheim that the Soviets would not be able to operate in such a remote area that he had deployed only a few companies of border guards. The Soviets pushed them aside with ease. On the 7th of December, Soviet columns rolled into the straggling streets of Suomussalmi. From here, the Soviets were poised to advance west across the narrow waste of Finland and cut the country in half. With the exception of a naval reversal off Hanko, the first week of operations had gone well for the Soviets. It seemed that another week would secure victory. They were so confident, they established a new government in one of the villages they had liberated in the Karelian Isthmus, a government which was sure to be in Helsinki in the very near future.